Banks.
Banks, he just, I don't even know, he couldn't even tell you, like, at any point when you speak to him what the problem is.
Damn.
I put him, like, where I put Marquise.
Oh, wow.
Like, they just have something internally that's going on with them that gives them some sort of resentment towards me, and I just don't even care about what's going on.
When you go through obstacles and hard times in your life, nobody cares. You know, they like the ultimate, the end of the movie. They don't really care, you know, about the ins and outs and the hard times. They just want to see the success story. And so regardless of how much they hear me on the radio, I don't ever want to be the one that's not in the rucker. I'd rather be a god in hip-hop in the streets than to be, you know, a big commercial pop star, you know, that's not respected by my peers.
Christopher Lloyd was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and raised in the South Jamaica, Queens in New York City. His father spent most of Lloyd's childhood in prison, leaving his mother to raise him and his two siblings. As Lloyd Banks grew up, he started listening to hip-hop, and he says his main early influence was Big Daddy Kane, but he also listened to Rakim and Slick Rick, and then eventually liked the newer generation at that time, which was Mobb Deep, Snoop Dogg, Tupac, Biggie, and so on and so forth.
My earliest influence was it ranged from Rakim to Slick Rick, Big Daddy Kane, the newer generation with Mobb Deep, Snoop Dogg, Biggie, of course, Tupac.
He says that when he performed for the first time at age 11 or 12, that's when he decided he wanted to become a rapper. Because he liked the thrill of the stage, and to build his name, he decided to go around and battle people in the Queens and also places close by. So everybody that was in that neighborhood knew Banks as the best battle rapper there. After building this buzz, he wanted to give rap his all, and so he dropped out from August Martin High School at the young age of 16. By this time, Lloyd Banks knew and was close to Tony Yayo as they came up in the same area, Southside Jamaica, Queens. They were only 4 years apart, so they hung out a lot, and this is how the bond between Yayo and Banks happened. They both liked rapping and would rap with each other whenever they got a chance. They also released a couple of freestyles. For his stage name, he took his great-great-grandfather's name, Banks, which was passed on by his uncles who also shared it. 50 Cent came into the picture a lot later. 50 had a bunch of mixtapes put and a buzz around him, especially around Queens. He met up with a couple of new upcoming rappers, and you guessed it, Tony Yayo was one of them. For Banks, Yayo noticed that as he got a bit older, he got better with time. So Yayo introduced Banks to 50 Cent. Initially, all of them three were not hanging out due to age difference, 50 being about 7 years older than Banks, but a 3-year age gap with Tony Yayo. 50 Cent heard Lloyd Banks and loved the type of lyrics he was spitting, so that's when G-Unit officially formed. Then in 2001, Banks, Yayo, and 50 would end up recording a lot of music together. The first track they ever recorded all together was called Bad News. It would end up getting featured on the 50 Cent is the Future mixtape. But the first track that the public heard of all of them together was a track called That's What's Up, on the May 2002 mixtape he released called Guess Who's Back. However, this almost didn't happen. Lloyd Banks, on September 10, 2001, was shot twice at a nightclub in Southside Jamaica, Queens. He was hit in the back and stomach and ran to the nearest hospital after suffering the injuries.
A couple minutes later, I could have, died from blood loss, you know what I mean? But I felt like it wasn't over for me, you know what I mean? Like, that's why I kept saying, like, man, just stitch my shit up, let me go, you know what I mean? I'm about to go on tour.
He woke up the next morning to news of the 9/11 terrorist attacks and watched from his hospital bed as the Twin Towers fell to the ground. After this, Banks decided not to go out anymore and just strictly focus on recording music with Yayo and 50. They ended up teaming with DJ Who Kid and started releasing mixtapes to build up their buzz. From that buzz, 50 Cent ended up signing with Shady Records under Aftermath and under Interscope, and then they ended up granting him his own record label, G-Unit Records. The first two artists signed to G-Unit were Tony Yayo and Lloyd Banks. This is when Banks actually got his first major label deal, and his first major label album appearance was on 50 Cent's Get Rich or Die Tryin', on the track Don't Push Me alongside Eminem. So Banks got the best placement as a new and upcoming artist as he featured with the greats, 50 Cent, who was huge at the time, and Eminem, and still showed his class. Banks after that did not waste any time and ended up releasing his first ever mixtape called Money in the Bank in mid-2003. He then followed that Money in the Bank mixtape with a newer mixtape just 2 months later called Mo Money in the Bank. These mixtapes were just a way of Banks putting himself out there as a solo upcoming artist in the game, and also gearing up to the G-Unit debut album. The G-Unit debut album, Beg for Mercy, was released on November 14, 2003. It did very well, selling over 380,000 copies in its first week and featured on the US Billboard 200. However, there were only 3 artists in the album: 50 Cent, Lloyd Banks, and Young Buck. Tony Yayo was still in prison, and the game wasn't in the group yet. Banks got some shine in this album, and it was clear he was the most lyrical one in the group. And mind you, he was the youngest in the group as well. The album was a great leadway to Lloyd Banks' debut album, so he released his first single of his debut album right along the time Beg for Mercy was still selling large. The single was called On Fire, and it was released on April 2004. This single did very well for Lloyd Banks. It peaked on number 8 on Billboard Hot 100. This was the first time a G-Unit solo artist did this, because you have to remember 50 Cent was signed to Eminem label and not his own label. Then Banks released his first debut album, The Hunger for More, on June 29, 2004, and it skyrocketed to number 1 on Billboard 200 and sold 433,000 copies in its first week alone. This album was a huge success, and they didn't stop there. They still continued promoting it by releasing singles and also doing music videos for the songs. Singles such as I'm So Fly and Karma. When you think about it, they were hungry for more. With the success of his debut album, he also managed to release part 3 of his Mo Money in the Bank series called Cashing In on September 19, 2004. To add to the success in 2004, he got the title for Mixtape Artist of the Year. But with a lot of success comes a lot of hate. By this time, the game was already signed to G-Unit Records. It was after Banks' huge success that year that friction and tension started building up in G-Unit between the game and the rest of G-Unit crew. Banks speculated that the game was jealous about the attention Banks received after the success of his debut album, The Hunger for More, as well as Banks winning a lyricist title. However, this might not be entirely accurate, as people also speculated that Jimmy Henchman was the man behind the whole The Game versus G-Unit beef. After the huge success in 2004, Lloyd Banks had to take a step back since there were other artists in G-Unit, so it was better to release one album succeeding the other rather than competing with each other. For that, he did not release any solo projects in 2005. However, he wasn't all quiet. He featured on 50 Cent The Massacre album, Tony Yayo album Thoughts of a Predicate Felon, and even did a couple of features for other artists like Basta Rhymes and Young Buck. He also appeared on G-Unit First Lady Olivia's single Twisted. The year 2005 was meant for Lloyd Banks to lay low and, work in the shadows, gearing up to release his sophomore album in 2006, but no, trouble would come knocking. During August 2005, Lloyd Banks, Young Buck, and their entourage were traveling in a van after doing a show in Madison Square Garden. They ran a red light in Midtown Manhattan and were pulled over. Officers said they discovered weapons in the van, therefore arrested Banks and Buck. After going back and forth with this case for 4 months, prosecutors asked a judge to dismiss the charges after an investigation determined that neither Lloyd Banks nor Young Buck were in possession of the weapons. Felony gun charges against them were dropped in November 8th that year. Banks was now officially a free man and was happy he was getting back to work on his sophomore album, but trouble would come knocking once again. In the early morning hours of January 9th, 2010, in a Kitchener, Ontario hotel, an altercation took place between Banks and a concert promoter over performance fees. Banks and 3 of his associates were later charged with forcible confinement, aggravated assault and robbery, and released on $50,000 bail. Then 2006 came, and Banks had gotten into his cycle to release an album, but this time there was a huge fork in the road. Banks had started recording his sophomore album in 2005. He initially called it The Big Withdrawal, but this album ended up leaking online. How this happened was, Banks was sleeping with a couple women, and he accidentally left his CD in the room with them. They took the CD and ended up leaking it online, so he essentially lost a whole 23-track album of work. That album is still up for download. It's called The Big Withdrawal. The album was, and the idea behind it was great, but now we will never know how big the album could have been because of those 2 women. Regardless, Lloyd Banks is a monster in the studio and has a bunch of tracks stacked up and was already gearing up to release an album in 2006. Instead, he opted now to release a mixtape in 2006 called Gangrene Season Starts Now. Gangrene was supposed to be Banks' own record label apart from G-Unit, but we all know it never ended panning out, and the reason behind it is not known. On September 2006, he released the first single called Hands Up featuring 50 Cent and Eminem backing it up. But the single didn't perform as well as his previous first single of his debut album did. It peaked at number 84 on the Billboard chart. It did well on the Hot Rap chart, peaking at number 15. Street-wise, it was doing very good, but commercially, as they had hoped, it did not perform that well. Banks also pushed the street record with 50 Cent called Cake. However, 50 Cent never appeared in the video. Then in October of 2006, Lloyd Banks dropped his second studio album called Rotten Apple. The album debuted at number 3 with 143,000 copies sold in its first week. After the album release and its poor performance to what Banks and G-Unit as a whole was used to, they tried to promote the album by releasing singles, but they didn't perform well. As of September 2017, the album has sold 600,000 copies only, which is huge, don't get me wrong, but compared to its predecessors, not as good. Following the album, he decided to release another mixtape. This would be the final chapter of the Mo Money in the Banks series called The Gangrene Season Continues, released in December 18, 2006. In the same year, he appeared on two Eminem singles, You Don't Know, featuring 50 Cent and 3 Up. This year wasn't particularly the best for Lloyd Banks. Before the year would end, he received heartbreaking news about his father's passing. This was a huge blow as it made Lloyd Banks distance himself from music altogether. According to 50 Cent himself, Banks became musically uninspired and distanced himself from the group for almost a year. Everybody deals with grief differently. Some people use their grief as fuel to ignite a passion for something they love. Some people withdraw and become isolated, while others remain numb to the whole situation until they feel like they have enough strength to deal with the loss. So I can fully understand why Banks chose to distance himself with music. However, 50 did not understand this at all. In my opinion, Lloyd Banks losing his father is one of the main reasons why he has declined musically over the years. In 2008, Lloyd Banks would feature on G-Unit's next album called Terminate on Sight. It debuted at number 4 on the Billboard 200 and sold 102,000 copies within the first week. Compared to the first album, it did way less numbers commercially. But this was around the time Banks started having issues with his record label Interscope Records. Following poor performance from Lloyd Banks' Rotten Apple album and Terminate on Sight, Lloyd Banks and Tony Yayo were both dropped from Interscope Records. However, this would not stop Banks from doing what he does best. So he geared up and released 2 mixtapes in 2009. In 2010, he announced release of his third studio album to be released that year called The Hunger for More 2. But prior to this release, he did a bunch of singles for the album featuring various artists like Jeremy, Kanye, Ryan Leslie, and many others. One of the singles that did well was Beamer, Benz, or Bentley. What's interesting is after this release of Beamer, Benz, or Bentley, Interscope reached out to him and tried to sign him back. Banks mentioned this was after they saw the success of his singles. Lloyd Banks, however, did not go back and also revealed he had signed a deal with EMI. Banks had this to say about EMI. It's refreshing to see the EMI staff excited about my project. They have the passion and energy I haven't seen in a while. It's worth mentioning that his third album, The Hunger for More 2, debuted at number 26 in Billboard 200 chart, selling 49,000 copies in its first week. This was a significant fall in number of units sold, and many speculated this to be the end of Lloyd Banks and G-Unit as a whole. Well, they weren't wrong. In 2015, during a performance at BB King's in New York, Banks addressed his long-awaited Cold Corner 3 mixtape and expressed disappointment at the current state of hip-hop. He explained that the project would be released commercially and available for pre-order. However, if he's not satisfied with the pre-order numbers, it will not be released. You guessed it, the numbers weren't as good, and hip-hop at the time was starting to take on a whole different sound. In June 2018, Banks would call it quits and left G-Unit Records as announced by 50 Cent in an Instagram post. 50 later talked about the indifferences they had in G-Unit and said this in particular to Lloyd Banks.
Biggest disappointments is the unfulfilled potential of Lloyd Banks and Tony Yayo of G-Unit. Both Power's rise and G-Unit's fall are testaments to how growth is often the key element in any successful journey. I always felt that if I had done a better job teaching Banks and Yayo how to evolve and change their habits, they each would be in better places right now.
He would also go on to call Banks lazy in his book, Hustle Harder, Hustle Smarter, which Lloyd Banks would seemingly respond to in his song Stranger Things. Your favorite's nowhere near me when I'm dedicated. Always humble, usually disciplined, and never hated. Call me quiet. Call me lazy, talent never faded. It's frustrating when your grinding ain't appreciated. Lloyd Banks hasn't spoke on the matter publicly. However, he has sent words that seem to be aimed at 50 Cent on numerous songs, including Cold Summer Freestyle and Stranger Things. In between Lloyd Banks' departure from G-Unit in June 2021, he remained relatively quiet other than introducing a clothing line and touring places such as Australia. Lloyd Banks wasn't doing interviews or releasing any new projects other than some freestyles. However, fans would be surprised as he would release his fourth album and first album in 11 years named The Course of the Inevitable, which sold 12,000 copies in its first week. The album received very positive reviews, and Lloyd Banks seemed happy with the reception as he spoke about more upcoming music at a concert he held in Sony Hall.
Like, I mean, Banks is still like one of my favorite MCs. Like, we used to go bar for bar in the studio on who was going to get the second verse. So I fuck with Banks. I hated the fuck out of Yayo, but I mean, I'm 40 now. It's like damn near. So there's no animosity with him either.
Regarding his relationships, Lloyd Banks, who is 41, has never experienced engagement, unexpectedly found himself entangled in a passionate affair with Yaris Sanchez, a talented dancer and movie artist. Despite their connection, they did not have any children together. However, Lloyd does have a daughter named Christina Ryan Lloyd from a recent relationship in 2016. Additionally, he had encounters with Nikki B in 2011 and was in relationships with Olivia Longett from 2004 to 2006 and Taylor Rain. But sadly for Lloyd Banks' diehard fans, that's just about it for his relationships that are publicly known. In conclusion, following his fourth studio album, Banks said the best is yet to come. But by reigniting his passion and avoiding dwelling on past achievements or setbacks, Lloyd Banks has positioned himself favorably for potential induction into the Hall of Fame. The comeback, as evidenced by both the notable features on his records and the widespread support he's garnered, reflects not just a personal resurgence, but also mirrors shifts in the broader hip-hop culture. Now, over 20 years after his debut, Lloyd Banks has the opportunity to reshape his legacy, elevating it from a narrative of unfulfilled potential to a triumphant return to the genre's forefront.